So good morning and welcome to a talk on the coal industry. We've looked at sort of mining before, but not particularly at coal. It's once ubiquitous and obviously nearly always been hidden from sight beneath our feet, although in some areas it can be seen right up onto the surface. The industry has now all gone. So let's have a look at what is coal to begin with. It was formed around 290 to 350 million years ago during the Carboniferous age. This is when Yorkshire was almost on the equator, and obviously we've moved since then, especially on a day like today. And during that time, warm seas came over it and they raised and they fell, laying down sort of limestone in layers. And sometimes this sequence was interrupted from river deltas coming from the north, from Scotland. And it was this really decaying vegetation, woods and other things like this that created the coal layers. You can see they've been made into seams as well, sometimes alternating with sandstone, mudstones and siltstones, and quite often always associated with clay as well. So that's why sometimes the pottery industry and the coal industry go hand in hand in those areas. So really the first use that they found of documenting of clay, of coal, has been during the Ice Age, when it was probably used as a heat source. So this is a sort of kiln, a pottery kiln. This is on display in Doncaster Museum, quite actually a fascinating museum because that includes the sort of the fenlands as well as the Roman occupation of Danum, as it was then called, and going on to the coal industry and it being a Georgian market town as well. So quite a fascinating museum down there. And this is probably what sort of first sort of heated these kilns around here, although they preferred charcoal. This is where the sort of wood is piled up, lit, and really they are getting rid of the water from the wood to form charcoal. That burns at a lot higher temperature, and because it was largely used for iron smelting as well, whereas coal you can't sometimes get to that high temperature as well. But this obviously led to the decimation of woodland all over the country, really. And because the Romans continued to use coal as well, probably as a heating source for their baths and things like that. But it doesn't seem that there was any great widespread use of it. And it was seen as not being a valuable commodity at all. Because even when we come to the Domesday Book, there's no mention of coal in there at all, which is quite a surprise. The Yorkshire coalfield, let me go back on. The Yorkshire coalfield is the biggest in Britain, and it sort of tilts from west to east, coming down the country. So this is where we see it nearer the surface in these areas up here. It largely spreads as far as sort of Keighley, Skipton, that type of area, where it's fairly poor coal coming out onto the surface of the moors around there, really, and you've only got to dig down a foot to get at it. And that's why we see the early part of the industry in, let's say, the West Riding, curving down this lighter green area here, because over here, these are the much greater, deeper coal deposits that really couldn't be mined until the sort of end of the 18th century, but largely within the 20th century, these huge deposits were mined. It's probably best seen is that it's split essentially by the M1. If you follow this down here, where the sort of the lighter shale, where the lighter coal deposits are, and the deeper coal deposits are as well. And there's really two outliers from this as well. Further over from Halifax, coming over probably about down there, is Todmorden. They had some coal mines, but that was part of a Lancashire coalfield around there. And another one which is unique to itself is a much higher up over here, and that's the Ingleton pits they had around there that were sort of, because it's an unusual area, there's a lot of slate around there, a lot of tectonic plate movement, and all sorts of other things like that. So there's coal immediately in that area around there. So that's quite a unique area, because that was mined during the 19th century, right to the turn of the century around there. But as we see, rather like down here, what we consider to be the coal areas, really from Barnsley to Rotherham and further south from that. Whereas largely we've probably forgotten a lot about these many mines were in the Halifax, Huddersfield, and to this side there's sort of the Penistone area of Wakefield today. So the coal, was originally dug from the 13th century as a sort of, I guess, as a domestic product, perhaps needed for other things as well. And this is where it was dug. It was found where it was close to the surface. So that was the inland trade, but there's also a coastal trade as well, because coal can be washed up on the beaches as well. And so some of that coming down the east coast, especially much higher up, let's say at sea houses and other places in sort of County Durham, Northumberland as well, there's a lot more sort of coal washed up around there. So there's this sort of sea trade going down the east coast as well, probably serving London as well, all the way down there. And so it was really the lord of the manor and the monasteries that owned the mineral rights under the ground. And as we see here, is that the lords of the manor weren't particularly interested in the mineral rights, because it was seen as because they having no great value to them. They were more interested in sort of sheep and agriculture, and so they sold off or leased the mineral rights to other people who could speculate where there might be, and they would probably have some amateur geologists as well who would be able to follow where a seam of coal from the surface might have gone as well. And so they dug these sort of these simple bell pits where they sort of dug straight into the ground and then widened at the base. And we see there in 1332 in Ossett, men were fined 6 pence for not backfilling the pits in the New Park, as it was called. And these were not they're very dangerous, really, because these pits could be 30 feet deep. So if you're just walking around in that area, you could easily fall down one of these pits. And they're quite obvious even today where some of these pits are. They were dug really until the end of the 19th century. With technology in these sort of where the coal wasn't really particularly valuable up on the moors and hillsides and things like that, were always dug by the bell pit method largely. And again, in 1339, they were still ordered to backfill their pits to stop them being a danger to other people as they passed. 1367, we have another date here. Sir John Fitzwilliam, he allowed mining to commence down at Elsecar, just south of Barnsley, 6 miles south of Barnsley, just by Wentworth Woodhouse. We'll be picking that story up a lot later on as well. And so these simple bell pits were dug to the end of the 19th century. They dug down and outwards. They stopped when they think that the sides will be about to fall down and bury them alive. Sometimes on the much steeper slopes, the adits or levels were dug straight into the hillside because here they could access, hopefully, larger seams of coal which were lower down. And that's always the thing about it, was trying to get the bigger seams which are below the surface. The advantage of an adit or a level into the hillside is that they could be built at a tilt, because even these bell pits, part of a problem with them is that they easily hit the water table, and because they were filled up with water, they had to use buckets hauled up to empty that water out. But by digging into the hillside, they could build they could dig in and add it at a certain angle so the water would drain out of it. But because they were much more dangerous in a way due to the potential collapse of a ceiling with the huge weight of it above. So they'd use probably simple props as well. And they're also slightly better in one way, is that there's sort of slightly better circulation, because the air circulation, because they weren't digging particularly far into a hillside, and therefore the air could circulate a lot more, which made it easier for the miners to dig in there. And obviously they weren't going far enough in probably to hit sort of pockets of methane and other things like that, which are potentially explosive to them. And so some of this technology was actually brought up from Cornwall by the tin miners down there, because they had to go a lot deeper to mine the tin, and that really, that technology was then adapted to coal, and we see this introduction of much larger adits into the hillsides, enlarged enough so that ponies, small ponies, could go in there and pull coal out on sledges. So we really had wooden runners on the bottom of those. So this is a piece at the end, the National Coal Board produced. I think it was filmed in the 1930s, this bit of film, and I've got it from the National Coal Mining Museum in just outside of Wakefield. So this gives an idea of what medieval mining was like.
Hitherto, coal had been either dug straight from a seam in the hillside or from shallow bell pits. Although the Yorkshire coalfield stretches north from the deep seams in South Yorkshire, the coal was easy to get at in West Yorkshire, but this coal, closer to the surface, was often of inferior quality. The steam pumps now meant that the threat posed by flooding was eliminated, and deeper mines could be dug.
So it was very simple sort of technology that they're using. Like I said before, is most of these lands belong to the to either the monasteries or to major landowners, because they didn't really do any coal mining themselves. They sold the mineral rights on or gave long leases. And but come the dissolution, is that many of the landowners bought up the lands of the monk monasteries for sometimes just purposely their mineral rights, because we see round about the sort of coming into the 16th century is that coal are being mined more for domestic consumption, really, as the population started to grow. So there's some sort of valuable coming into that as well. And because the mines then, because started opening really in the West Yorkshire area, sort of Wakefield, Leeds, Halifax and Huddersfield, because they were easy to gain, the coal deposits underneath. And because much higher up in the north, around in County Durham, is that that was sort of much more commercialised up there, largely because they could have export markets, whereas the sort of Yorkshire coal seam was really landlocked, whereas up in the sort of County Durham is that they had potential to put coal down the River Tees or onto the coast and bring it easily down to markets in London, whereas sort of West Yorkshire didn't really have that advantage at all. And we really see that sort of this sort of commercial mining really began in earnest probably in the 1600s. Again, there were very small pits, but there were sort of hundreds of these pits as well. And so there's a lot of sort of speculation going on, and that's why we see this split where the M1 is, the speculation taking part on the west of the M1 there in the Halifax and Huddersfield areas around there. The agriculturalist, I'll say a couple of hundred years later, William Cobbett, was travelling from Leeds to Sheffield in 1830. This is what he put in his book, Rural Rides. He said it is coal and iron and coal. And he was basically traversing the M1 that would go down today. And that's really what was going on at that time. But really what we see then was the mining technology, being sort of improvements in that. Although sort of pickaxes, wooden pit props, buckets, and small amounts of explosives were all used in sort of mining technology, because they were probably fairly laughable, really. Really right up until the end of the sort of 19th century, going into the 20th century, nothing had really changed for those miners. But because really what hampered them was this water, the high water tables or water draining in straight away from the rock and clay around them. And so this sort of increase in coal production led to Newcomen producing his atmospheric engine. He developed that in 1712, and it was really a piston that would draw water up from a greater depth than was, let's probably say, than the 30 foot. So they could empty these water from the bottom of these pit shafts. It wasn't didn't take off much. Newcomen died in 1729, but others took up how it would work in practice, and that was improved with James Watt's steam engine that was built around about 1763, or his better ones were, and it meant that sort of more water could be pumped up these because quite often with the Newcomen engine is that he was pumping up probably centimetres or inches of water, and there was more water actually coming into the pit. So that was the problem to be solved, was that he had the technology, but we didn't have the power to do that. And so that sort of first introduction of that sort of Newcomen engines, the very poor ones, were introduced in sort of the Wakefield and Huddersfield area, but really they didn't last at all. And so we see that in 1787 at Flockton, they were mining a sort of a 3-foot deep seam of coal, then the biggest found that was closest to the surface, and they were able to drain the water out of that, because they weren't going down deep, but they knew that there were these big coal deposits further down, deeper down, that had to get at. But it wasn't until 1795 that the technology was advanced enough, and the first commercial Newcomen engine, his name still stuck with it, was put into use by William Wentworth at Elsecar, 6 miles south of Barnsley, because about 1.5 miles from the great stately home Wentworth Woodhouse, of where William Wentworth lived. And that pump was able to draw water up from a depth of 130 feet. And that made all the difference to the industry. And that really was the start of the South Yorkshire coal industry around there. Because that pump, which is shown here, was in use until 1923, when it was used by a steam engine. In 1923, it was electrified with the pump still continuing, and it could draw out 600 gallons of water a minute. The pits then were going a lot deeper than that, probably 300 or 400 feet at that time as well, to access these sort of great seams, which should be up to sort of 15 feet thick. But the problem remained is that although you could mine the coal and get it out, the transportation was extremely expensive, because it could only go on wagons, and they could only go probably within a day's journey of these pits. Although it sort of did quite a lot of Yorkshire, is that other places couldn't develop really because it was too far away, and the coal, by the time it got there, was really too expensive for domestic consumption. So it was really going to these mills, but it was making some of those mills uneconomic in a way. They couldn't compete with the mills which were closer to the source of coal. And so it led to sort of this transport revolution, and really the coal was one of the main reasons for first of all the making of the river navigations. The first one in this area was the River Don, and that got a Navigation Act in 1740 to make the river there navigable from Rotherham to its confluence with the River Trent, because they took out sort of bows, they straightened it, they made sure that there was a depth of water in there that these boats could get along. Because as soon as it could get along the Don, it could go down the River Trent, it could serve Nottingham and other things on that river system, although Nottinghamshire had its own coal industry as well. But probably more importantly, it could go down the Humber and then down the coast, because the great demand, even in those days, would have been from London. In 1751, it was extended all the way into Sheffield city centre, which meant is that this coal could easily get in for the iron industry in Sheffield as well. So these sort of industries went hand in hand with the supply of coal in that area. And if you sort of proof it was needed to see how efficient these canals were, and it was the opening of the Leeds-Liverpool Canal in 1777 between Leeds and Skipton, where coal came into Skipton at half the price that had been brought in by wagon, and in much bigger quantities. And really that spurred development in Skipton for it to become a cotton town. It meant that sort of cotton could come in from the ports in Liverpool. But the main thing about that was the steam machinery in order to get them the coal needed to fire the machinery for the cotton industry as well. And you say it led to other navigation acts. The ones particularly associated with mining are the rivers Dearne and Dove, just south of Barnsley. They were made navigable in 1793. And you say further is that two canals were built off that, one going to Worsborough, as they call it, where the corn mill is today, and the other in same year to Elsecar as well. So because they getting at that coal there, or being able to go down the rivers Dearne and Dove to its confluence with the River Don, fairly close to the centre of Rotherham. And therefore, it served into that system. So this much higher quality coal coming from Elsecar could easily get down to Sheffield and then out down the coast as well. I'm going to say where that Dearne and Dove Canal came to a T junction just below the centre of Barnsley, they built a 14.5-mile canal there, it going westwards to Silksen and then eastwards to join the air and colder navigation. So both coal from here could now go southwards through the River Don. It could go northwards along this Silksen Canal, or Barnsley Canal as they know it, and come out onto the air colder navigation, which meant that it could go up the River Ouse and other places like that, and down to Leeds as well, Wakefield and all sorts of other places as well. And so this sort of led to the sort of efficiencies and the enlargement of these collieries, especially at Elsecar down there where the deep coal was first mined. But because it probably wasn't a happy existence. Sorry, there's the canal. This is the Elsecar Canal, which partly stands still there today, because the canal went out of, was no longer needed when the railway came in 1850. Part of the railway, part of the canal was infilled, and now this is sort of the part of the canal that remains there today. The Dearne and Dove navigation, has broken its banks. That was closed in the Worsborough one in 1906. The Elsecar one used for, complete closure in 1928. None of these canals are navigable anymore, nor is the River Dearne. So it's completely gone because they were no longer needed. But it was hard work as well. And because really at the turn of the 19th century is that mining really became a family concern. Men weren't directly employed by the mine owner, is that they would probably get a basic pay to keep them on, but they would be paid by the amount that they mined. So the coal brought to the surface and weighed. And so they got to pay you for that way. And so some days, they were removing an awful lot of waste and again, indeed speculating themselves where a good seam might be. And they've started to employ their family, but probably weren't getting paid, but in order to remove this waste as fast as possible, and indeed the coal as well. And so that not only that is that they, out of the sort of basic salary they got, they'd have to pay for their own tools, so the shovels and pickaxes. They'd have to pay for the candles and also the pit props. So because they heavily weighted against them, but I guess the pit owner will thought that if they had a vested interest in winning the coal, they would buy these and dig like mad. And then because they're getting their family involved, because were this pictured here of women, their wives coming down the pit as well to haul the corves along. Very young children from the age of 5 or 6 were employed by them to open and close the air traps as well. And it was largely about the removal of the waste which were built up in the tunnels and things like that, which had to be brought to the surface. So it was quite an expensive process. But children generally started at the age of sort of perhaps 8 or 9, and their first job was being as trappers of opening and closing these air doors, which were very important. And I say, as they worked as family groups, they did the same shifts as their parents as well, quite often starting at 3 in the morning and doing a 12-hour shift. And I say, from moving from the sort of opening and closing the air traps is then they moved on to moving the corves underneath the ground. Some were called hurriers. They're the people that pulled the carts like this lady is here from the front, and others were called thrusters. They worked from the back, pushing that cart to get that sort of load out from these small seams. These seams quite often only sort of between 2.5 feet deep, really. So because everything was very small, the space that was unlit, largely because of the cost of the candles down there as well. And also the candles were proving that they could also light pockets of methane as well, so creating these blasts down there as well. And so it wasn't an easy life down there because they're largely in the dark. Children would fall asleep down there and get hit by parents. Indeed, some might have worked for other miners down there as well, and because they kept prodded to keep them awake and because it keep them going through those very long dark days underground. So we see here is that the first pulling these sort of carts, they were first on sledges really before they started putting wheels on them to make it slightly easier, but that because they demanded a fairly level ground in there, so extra works being to improve that. And because these wagonways were then built above ground as well as below ground, and the first sort of public railway in the world was we normally say it's the Middleton Railway in Leeds, but that was a steam railway. But really the first sort of public wooden wagonway, quite often attributed to the north as well, was the Lake Lock Railway of 1798. This ran from Stanley on the Air Calder navigation, that's fairly close to Castleford, and went to Outwood, 3 miles away. Because it was on wooden. It's a wooden railway, meant to have wooden rails, and the cause was of round about this height as well. They were hauled by horses along here, and the difference on this one is that it ran past several collieries en route, so it wasn't just serving one colliery like the Middleton Railway, as we'll see a little later on, was built for. And it was also built up to the Air Calder navigation, so other things could be brought in from that, let's say wood for the wood props, and other things were moved on it, was stone probably for buildings and things like that, lime as well for agricultural purposes around there as well, because that wooden railway wagonway didn't last much beyond the age of the railway and closed in 1836, indeed replaced by a steam line itself. Other wagonways, as we can see here, this is actually at Silksen itself, where you can see this sort of corf, as they're called, for carrying coal. This was built from the Silksen Canal basin. That's where the Barnsley Canal ran to, the one that went through near enough the centre of Barnsley and out to the Leeds, out to the Air Calder navigation. And this went down to the bottom of the valley, and then other wagonways were built from there up to where the mines were, largely on the tops. These corves are slightly bigger than the ones which would be underground. These held about 3 tons of coal in these, because they pulled by horses as well. And as you see, it was built by the Canal Company. And really, this is all associated the coal and transport industries, about who got the price of moving the coal around, or the coal tax for moving it. So the Canal Company here, the Barnsley Canal Company, built these wooden wagonways because it meant that the coal collieries wouldn't take their coal anywhere else but on the canal. Say the date on there, 1809. The canal opened to Silksen in 1802. So it's really this sort of, as we'll see, is tying the mines into the transport network. And because when we come to the sort of age of steam railway, because they led to a lot of friction, as we'll see a bit later on as well. And but really these wooden wagonways and small scale railways really sort of went out of favour really by the 1860s with the coming of the steam railways. So one of the other things that were really driving this, the demand for coal, were the industries that were springing up now. So if we're looking about the sort of the 1820 mark, is that the sort of, and indeed during the Napoleonic Wars, was this sort of, as most wars are, a great race for new technology. And because this is the sort of the opening of the much bigger ironworks down in sort of Rotherham and Sheffield down there, which demanded greater and greater amounts of coal, and also the West Yorkshire textile industry as well, with their newfound steam engines, creating this demand for coal as well. And even more so come the 1820s, with, let's say, the rise of the Bradford worsted industry and these really massive mills that hadn't been really around until that period, because they creating an even greater demand for there. So the sort of surge in coal was phenomenal, really. Around about in the mid 18th century, there were mining around about nationally about 3 million tons a year. Between 1780 and 1790, this doubled to 6.5 million tons. Then with the onset of the Napoleonic Wars, the demand for iron, the demand for blankets, tunics, and other things like that, we see that the rise in output was to 16 million tons in Britain. That was, like I say, largely in the north as well. And by 1830, with these huge, vast ironworks and the worsted mills and things like that, production had ramped up again to 30 million tons. So really we're seeing a doubling, a tripling of that industry in sort of a 30, 40-year period of time. And really, it was coming down to the movement of coal again, is that obviously you can move it on the canal fairly cheaply and easily, because it only really needs one man on a barge to carry 6 or 7 tons of coal. But it wasn't. It was slow to move it around, and it was also difficult as well with to get the coal sometimes from these collieries because of the inclines to take them up and down. And so really before even the Leeds-Liverpool Canal being completed in 1816, Yorkshire had its first commercial steam railway. And this was for transporting of coal from the Middleton pits, which are about 3 miles to the south of Leeds city centre. And because they wanted to bring that coal up to the coal stave that stood really at the end of Leeds-Liverpool Canal and where the air colder navigation began. The problem with that is that they could output more, but the technology of moving that goods around was limited by initially the wooden wagonway that they had down there. And that's why we see even a bit later on than sort of 1812, which is on this bit of film coming up, is that the first railway built in Yorkshire was from Leeds to Selby. In effect, that was near enough a colliery railway as well, because it was all about moving coal, moving from to avoid the taxes paid, the collieries had to pay for the movement of their coal along the air colder navigation. And that's why in 1834, they built the railway from Leeds out to Selby. And so Selby being on the River Ouse, is that the collieries themselves could, because they pay for the cost of the movement, but then not pay tax to the navigation company. So it was avoiding the air colder navigation. And we see the air colder navigation, in fact, it was built with the Port of Hull, with the Port of Gould in 1826 at the head of the Humber. The navigation company there wanting the Port of Gould because they didn't want to pay the Port of Hull for the export of coal and other goods and things like that. So they're all trying to get around one another by not paying the taxes that were demanded by the transport system. But because that's slightly getting ahead of ourselves, and say eventually that line from Selby was extended across the River Ouse, and then went direct to Hull itself, and say coming into the coal dock, which is near enough near where the marina is today. And because other lines were built out there as well, especially from Barnsley, coming into the same sort of area as well, the line that goes across to the south of the Wolds, that's now been taken up as well. So this picture here is from Walker's book of Yorkshire costume. It was published about, it must have been after 1812, because we see here the steam railway developed here by Matthew Murray, and behind there, assuming that is the Middleton Pit. So this is really sort of, again, what a miner might have worn in those days, but probably not down the pit, because it was heavy, dirty job down there, and they actually mined naked or with not much on, because it probably wasn't worth it at all, getting so hot, sweaty, and you come out black from the coal. But we can see here is what Matthew Murray developed from that wooden wagonway, is that he developed a steam engine that would pull these corves of coal along here. He did have a slight problem with the technology, because they laid down iron rails to begin with, and there was no traction between the wheels of the engine and that of the iron rails. And to overcome this problem, he had a third wheel underneath, and so it had a cog and pinion railway in order to propel it along. Otherwise, those wheels just get spinning round and round and round, and that's how it overcame that problem until, say, bigger engines were built, and the iron, they changed the content of that, so there's more friction between those two.
Mills needed a constant and ever-increasing supply of coal. To supply the mills of Leeds, Charles Brandling, owner of pits in Middleton Woods 3 miles outside the town, built a wooden wagonway with horses pulling the corves. But it was engineer Matthew Murray who devised a steam engine that would do the work, and so the first commercial steam railway was created in 1812. That's 13 years before George Stephenson pulled passenger coaches with locomotive number 1 on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. A world away, cheaply built back-to-back houses were thrown up, but without any thought being given to sanitation or clean water. Leeds' population grew from 94,000 in 1801 to 250,000 in 1851. By the end of the century, that number had gone up to 500,000. Similar in growth to both Sheffield and Bradford. But all three places suffered the same problems: cholera, overcrowding, and an infant mortality rate of 1 in 5. Indeed, the average lifespan was a mere 29 years.
So let's look at the working conditions as well. So there wasn't just the risk of sort of flooding in these mines, but to say the deeper they got, they came across other problems as well, primarily methane gas that was trapped inside the pockets of the coal, sometimes called fire damp as well. And this could easily explode because they're using naked flames of candles down there. And that's the only way, because they probably one small candle to illuminate where the miner was digging. But it was an explosion in 1812 up in Gateshead that killed 92 miners, that led Humphrey Davy to design a lamp that wouldn't cause explosions. But in itself, it didn't solve all the miners' problems, because if the open candle created an explosion, now they couldn't smell the methane at all. And it was a silent, deadly gas, really. And that could kill as well. And because this is sort of unknown, is that it sort of led to the mine owners themselves. Have I just lost them? Sorry, just checking. It led to the mine owners themselves saying now they had these safety lamps is that it was fine now to dig as deep as you wanted because there's not going to be any explosions at all. And so that was another problem. The other problem they always suffered was really from black lung as well, from inhaling the coal dust around there, led to a range of sort of breathing diseases as well, and ultimately to an early death. They say working in cramped conditions led to bone diseases. I'm going to say here's Cobden in 1853, writing in his book, The White Slaves of England, even known by then. I can say for the woke generation is that perhaps miners and things like that be viewed completely differently. He says, in Yorkshire, the collier of 50 is usually an aged man. He looks overstrained and stiffened by labour. So that was sort of their sort of short life that they lived down underground. And I guess that's why in this period is that it urged families to get on, to maybe get a bit more of an education, because they didn't want their children to go down the mine as well. But we see this sort of period from sort of 1810 to 1850 was a period of agitation with men demanding the vote, really coming through Chartism, and again the artificial prices of corn. And in 1842 was the year women and children were banned from working down the mines. And we'll see a little later on with the act a little later on. And miners in the Halifax area formed the Miners' Association. And on the 20th of February 1844, they were demanding a living wage and also better working conditions. So it wasn't any great demand, but really it was the first sort of union that had been formed. And on the 20th of February 1844, 4,000 people stopped work in the Halifax area, demanding, say, higher pay and better working conditions. The colliery owners met in Wakefield because this sort of was spreading to the other pits. And the pits then were all privately owned by different men. And they decided that any member of a union wouldn't be allowed back into work. You can say this led on the 1st of May 1844, just a few months later, to almost every colliery in the West Riding downing tools and going out on strike. In retaliation, some of the colliery owners threw those in rented cottages that they owned out of those as well. And that seemed to be the turning point as part of that strike. And the other point is that they were no longer getting paid, so they really ran out of money and had to return to work, but on the terms of the colliery owner himself. In 1858, the union was revived again and would fight more and more fights with the owners over the next 100 years. So if we're looking at the sort of in the years sort of 1820 to 1840, 1850 at the moment, we look at some of these disasters as well. And this one is the Husker Pit at Silksen, or Husker Pit, they might pronounce it, down that area. And this happened on the 4th of July, 1838, when there's a storm overhead, with hailstones breaking windows. There was a fear of the mine flooding. And so the miners, the adult miners who were down there, got pulled up from the shaft to the surface. But the children working down there decided to go up adrift, which was at a slight angle. And this was really to let air into it, the pit bottom as well. And that shaft, which went at an angle that people could climb up, was guarded by these air doors. And so they got to the top door of this by climbing and shutting these air doors. When they opened the top air door, that flood water came into that shaft, pushed them all down to the air door down below, and drowned the majority of them. And so there's this memorial to them here. Again, there's two side by side. There's one's a boy and one's got a girl in it. And it shows the sort of height of the shaft that they were climbing up to escape. And if you don't really know the area, but if you search on Google for Moor End Lane, this is a road that goes across Silksen Common, goes under a disused railway bridge, and on the right by some woods there's car parking space for 4 or 5 cars down there. There's some steps that lead down into the woods, and the monument is straight ahead. It's not quite on the site of where the pit is. That's a little bit further over, but I guess this is the easiest place they could put that. There's also a monument to them in the churchyard of Silkstone Church. Silksen was much more important than Barnsley. This was a parish church for Barnsley here at Silksen. This is the monument to the Husker Pit disaster. 26 children between the ages of 8 and 15, boys and girls, because they died to that day on that disaster. I guess their names down here. We've got Joseph Birkinshaw, age 7 down there, Isaac Wright, age 12, Eli Hutchinson, he was aged probably 9 years or something like that. So they're all named down there on that monument to that. Like I say, there are other disasters. We'll look at 1 or 2 of those other ones as well. But really, it was this period, probably maybe because of this disaster, which sort of got national news everywhere, led to the government then to appoint commissioners to go out into the coalfields to see exactly what was going on firsthand. A chap called J.C. Simmons, I think he was a vicar, because he's mentioned somewhere else, but a Simmons with the same initials, so I think it might be one and the same. And because in 1842 he was sent out to the Huddersfield area, I guess particularly around the last of the summer wine area. And he put in his report, I guess it is quite long, but I'll read it out because it's interesting. Girls regularly perform all the various offices of trapping, hurrying, filling, riddling, tipping, and occasionally getting, just as they are performed by boys. One of the most disgusting sights I've ever seen was that of young females dressed like boys in trousers, crawling on all fours with belts around their waists and chains passing between their legs at day pits at Hunshelve Bank mine, and in many small pits near Home Firth and New Mills. It exists also in several other places. I visited the Hunshelve colliery on the 18th of January. It is a day pit, that is, there is no shaft or descent. The gate or entrance is at the side of a bank and nearly horizontal. The gate was no more than a yard high, and in some places not above 2 feet. When I arrived at the board or workings of the pit, I found at one of the sideboards down a narrow passage a girl of 14 years of age in boy's clothes, picking down the coal with the regular pick used by a man. She was half sitting, half lying at her work, and she found it tired her very much, and of course she didn't like it. The place where she was at work was not 2 feet high. Further on, men lying on the sides and getting. No less than 6 girls out of 18 men and children are employed in this pit. Whilst I was in the pit, the Reverend Mr. Bruce of Wadsley and the Reverend Mr. Nelson of Rotherham, and they didn't crawl into this pit, who accompanied me and remained outside, saw another girl of 10 years of age, also dressed in boys' clothes, who was employed in hurrying. And these gentlemen saw her at work. She was a nice-looking little child, but of course of as black as a tinker, and with a little necklace around her throat. In 2 other pits in the Huddersfield Union, I have seen the same sight. In one near New Mills, the chain passing high up between the legs of 2 of these girls had worn large holes in their trousers, and any sight more disgustingly indecent or revolting can scarcely be imagined than these girls at work. No brothel can beat it. On descending Messrs. Hopwood's pit at Barnsley, I found assembled around a fire a group of men, boys and girls. Some of them were at the age of puberty. The girls as well as the boys stark naked down to the waist, their hair bound up in a tight cap and trousers supported by the hips. At least 3/4 of the men for whom they hurry work stark naked, or with a flannel waistcoat, or waistcoat, I'd probably say that, only, And in this state, they assist one another to fill the corves 18 or 20 times a day. I have seen this done frequently. It is not supposed but that where opportunity thus prevails, sexual vices are of common occurrence. The picture of a nursery for juvenile vice, which you will go far and we above ground to equal. So that led to the act that stopped women and girls from working down the pits, but boys could still go down there. And it wasn't until 1872 that the act, this was the Education Act coming in here, that stopped boys from working down the pit below the age of 12, then the school leaving age. So I'll just continue on and we'll finish at Elsecar, because that's where we're heading now. And maybe because of that, it was the Fitzwilliams built a model village around their mine down here, because to prove that there could be good working conditions, and also the fact that, to say, the Wentworths had also been prime ministers and things like that, and probably brought visitors to show off that the mine that they had down here as well led to that. Because the Wentworth Woodhouse is probably about a mile and a half away from the mine. The house is on top of the valley side, the mine in the valley bottom, so one can't be seen from the other. Because it's about sort of 3 or 4 miles north of Rotherham as well. And as I say, we've seen here, there's been a mine down here since the middle of the 14th century. But from around 1840, he rebuilt the village. So change was coming as well. He full well knew that, because the railway, as we can see here, built in 1850 to connect not just Elsecar mine, but further down here, about a mile or so away, is the Corton Wood colliery as well, because they're fairly famous for the 1984 miners' strike as well. Until then, is that where we're looking along here, that was this site of the canal coming right up to the colliery. Over here that's where the Newcomen engine still stands today. It's the only one left in the position that it was built in. It has been restored, I guess, maybe the 1923 one with the electric pump and things like that. I've not seen it working, because I think they'll have it working various days during the year. But that's where the Newcomen engine was and where the pit head was in this area, and therefore you could see why the canal was over here, because it's only a short distance to it. Because in 1850 they built the railway up to here as well. You say that steam railway, you don't particularly go far on it. It sort of goes sort of a mile down the track, or it goes forwards and then just reverses straight back up. So it's no great railway. But they've laid track as far as Corton Wood in 2014, but that hasn't yet to be linked up. So at Elsecar, if you go down there, oops, it jumped again. So at Elsecar, if you go down there, because the village stands outside the mine, as we'll see on a film in a minute, and because they really didn't stint, is that John Carr was brought in to design the stable block, which is itself like a stately home at Wentworth Woodhouse, and was brought in to design some of the buildings around here. The most famous one down here is the Miners' Lodging House, because they eventually completed it. I think he did the designs, but it wasn't built until 1853. And this had in here rooms for 22 men, because he wanted some of the miners to come from Staffordshire. Maybe they had special qualities or expertise in deep mining or something like that. And because they became apartments in 1982, because it's only a small village, you can actually walk around in sort of 10 minutes. So that was the miners' lodging. Perhaps they were maybe like an advertisement. This is the type of property that you're going to live in. It's more of a stately home. Whereas I expected, probably a normal mine would expect a sort of a bit of a hovel, really, with a thatched roof, whereas it wasn't the case if you're coming up to Elsecar at all. Next door to it, a bit further down, stands Milton Hall. I don't know why it started doing this last week. So a little further down stands Milton Hall. This actually stands on the site of that medieval colliery that was down here. This was built in 1870 as a market hall, and later used as an assembly hall, and houses built behind for miners as well. It was sort of altered in 1922 and given its name Milton Hall because the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam was Lord Milton. So that's how it gets its name round there as well. Further round the corner, the colliery or Elsecar village, as we know it today, but you can go and visit, stands on this corner. But coming round the corner and a little bit further on, you can see these houses as well. There's 2 rows of them. That's Old Row. It's the oldest of them. Again, planned out by John Carr. These were actually built during Carr's lifetime because they appear on a map of 1801 that shows that they were there as well. A bit further on, like most places, that the church was built before many of these properties. The church opened in 1843, whereas we see that the workshops that surround the Elsecar mine opened between 1850 and 1897. The church is sort of beyond those trees along there. You can walk out the back of Elsecar to get to them as well. And so these were sort of the workshops, and there's some ironworks here as well that surrounded the mine. So it was really a sort of a mini sort of settlement in itself within the village of Elsecar, because it's surrounded by a wall, and as on the bit of film you see, you can only get in through a main gate as well. Some of the properties further down there either been demolished, or there's some sort of wall beyond there which has now been demolished so that you can park your car down there. It was bought by Barnsley Council in 1988 and created into a heritage centre. So the buildings are used for a variety of use. You can see down here, there's a visitor centre down there. It says Newcomen Engine there, the railway, and that's it says down to be, I think there's a canal walk down the Dearne Valley itself. There's also shops down here. There's sweet shops, there's a clock repairer, an antiques centre, a record shop, pub, tea rooms and furniture stores, etc. around there. And let's have a look at that's the Newcomen Engine and the building that it's associated with around there. So I'll end today on this bit of film. Hooray, it's here, on Elsecar itself. It's about 8 minutes long. There's just some music behind it, but I think it tells the story about it for itself. So if you're going to go down to Elsecar, you can obviously combine it with a visit to Wentworth Woodhouse. It's signposted off the M1 as well, because you can actually approach it from the Rotherham end or the Barnsley end, or come off one of those middle junctions where it is signposted off the M1. You come down through Hoyland and other places like that. It's quite difficult to find otherwise, but it's set in a lovely valley. Just beyond it, there's a park. There's a free car park, and you can wander around. The steam railway only operates on a Sunday, but obviously probably not at all this year. And that's really what you can see down there. And you can say, probably gone to their website to see where the Newcomen Engine, like I say, I think that was only finished being restored in 2018 or something like that. So that does work. But this is what you can see if you go down to Elsecar.